Now that we have the chairs completed, it's time to start adding more items to this room. Let's start by adding a heating system down here. So I'm going to select the floor tiles and duplicate this face, and I'm going to go ahead and select it. And then we can scale it along x-axis. I have proportional editing turned on, so I'm going to make sure that it's turned off and make it a bit thin like this, and then extrude it up something like here and add the bevel weight. Okay, I'm going to make it a bit more thinner and a bit shorter. Also, I'm going to make it a bit short on the y-axis. So we're sort of fine-tuning this a little bit. And let's just move it to the side here and then add an array modifier. And let's increase the number of count, and let's give it a bit more spacing like that. And place it around this area. And then we're going to go ahead and select this plant and flower pot. Duplicate that and move it down. An easy way to do this would be to just go to the side view and then pick it up and place it there. I'm using X-ray mode so that I can see through this chair, and just adjust this positioning a little bit more. And then I'm going to select this sort of plant and duplicate it and then rotate this in random direction a few times. So just rotate this a little bit. Okay. Let's rotate this slightly like that. And let's just place it down there. And then I'm gonna go ahead and select all of these leaves and this sort of entire plant, and I'm gonna move it down there as well. So let's go to the front view, and then we're gonna make a selection like that. And now we can hold on Control and deselect some of the items that we accidentally sort of selected while making a selection around this. Okay, I think we got everything. And let's Shift D to duplicate, and then again go to the side view and enable X-ray mode, take it and move it down here, and then go to the front view and move it down there. And now we can just sort of scale it up, place it above the ground, and then for this inner part I think we can just sort of scale it up. Let's enter into isolation mode. Select this bottom face and move our cursor to the selection. And then set our origin point to that part of the plant. And then if we scale it up, actually I accidentally clicked on geometry. Let's go to 3D cursor and then scale it up just a tiny bit like that. And then maybe select some of these random leaves. Create a copy of it, move it up there, rotate along the z-axis like that. Select maybe this and create a few more copies and rotate them like that. Okay, and now we need to create a plank up here for putting some item on it. Let's create a duplicate of that. And we're going to scale it down. Like that. And then we're going to scale it like that. And then let's just grab it and move it up here. Also center the origin point so that it's easier to move it. And we're going to move it out like that. And let's add the bevel weight. I'm going to scale it a little bit more. Create a copy of it, move it down, and then slightly to the x-axis. And now let's zoom in here and add some more items. So Shift right click to move our 3D cursor and then add a plane object. And we're going to scale it down. Let's scale it on the y-axis a tiny bit like that. Extrude it up. Now in edge selection mode, we can hold down Control and Alt and click here, and it's going to select the ring of edges, and then we can go ahead and bevel it. Let's add more cuts so that it's more rounder shape. Select this top face and move it down so that it's a bit thinner. And finally, we can go ahead and add a bevel modifier. And then let's adjust the bevel amount and increase the number of cuts. And then we can shade it smooth. And then finally select this top face and add an inset. Just a tiny inset like that for the screen. And let's create a pencil in this area, so shift right click so that it's above this tablet, and then we can add a circle. Change the size to something like 10, and then we can go ahead and scale it down. Fill the circle that we just created, extrude it out, and scale it up a little bit, then extrude again, and then add another extrusion like that, and just a tiny extrusion for the supporting loop. Now add a subdiv modifier and shade it smooth. Let's add one more loop cut here. And then we're going to move the entire pencil a little above like that. And let's go ahead and select this bottom face, add an inset, move it down on the z-axis, add an inset, and move it down again on the z-axis like that. So we might need to sort of play around with the shape a little bit like that. And let's make this edge sort of more pronounced. Okay. And then we can just rotate this on the x-axis. Let's go with 90 degrees, negative. And then on the z-axis, we can just rotate this maybe 10. Let's go with like 25. You know what, let's rotate this again, 50. Actually, I messed it up. Rotate along the axis 50 and negative. And then we're just going to place it down like there. And I think it's a little too thick for my liking, so we're going to go into editing mode like that. Select everything, and then we're going to start scaling it. And to exclude the z-axis, we're going to press Shift Z twice, so that it excludes the local axis of the object and not the global. So that just like that. And when you're doing that, you should be able to see it up there. And I think it's a little too long, so let's go ahead and select this. And we're gonna press G to grab, and then if we press X-axis, you can see it twice. So if you look in the top left corner, when you press these buttons, so you can see if we press Z twice, it's gonna move it along the local Z axis, and that's the object axis. Let's select our monitor, Shift D to duplicate, and then we're gonna move it on the Y axis like that over there. And then we might need to unparent this stand, so Alt P, and then clear parent, keep transformation, and then we're gonna rotate this top screen, so rotate this along X axis 90 degrees. Negative, so that this edge side and this bigger edge side is sort of on this side. You can also sort of move it to the other side. It really depends on the sort of look that you're going for. And then we can maybe select everything and scale it just a tiny bit down, and then move it down like that. Now we can go ahead and parent the stand again. And now we just need to place it, so we're going to rotate this on the z-axis, and then we just sort of move it. Let's fine tune it a little bit. Okay. I think I like the look of it, so I'm going to keep it there, and let's create a tiny Mac computer. Add a plane object, tap into edit mode, and scale it down. E to extrude, move it up like that. Add a subdiv modifier, shade it smooth, and then I think we can just do it manually, so we're going to remove some of the edge loops. And same thing on this side. I think we can select these two edge loops and then actually scale them on the z-axis. Now for the most part, Mac is just like a cube, so we don't need to add any other details. And let's also add a gaming controller. So shift right click here and then add a plane object, scale it down. Go to the top view and we're going to scale it on the y-axis even more. And then we're going to add a loop cut in the middle, and let's get rid of these vertices, and then we can add a mirror modifier on the x-axis and make sure to enable the clipping. And then we can add a loop cut here and then select this edge loop edge, and then we can extrude it on the y-axis like that. I think we might need to sort of move this slightly on the x-axis like that. And let's select this vertex point and we're going to move it on the x-axis just a tiny bit to this side. Select everything and add an extrusion. So we're sort of blocking out the shape. Let's maybe add two loop cuts on this side, add a supporting loop cut on this area, and maybe two loop cuts around here. And now we can add a subdiv modifier, hit it smooth. Let's go ahead and select these faces, scale them on the z-axis tiny bit, move them down on the z-axis a little bit. Let's select this edge and move it up. Also select this one and move both of these up a little bit like that. Let's select these two vertex points and scale them slightly to give it more of a rounder look. Same thing up here for these 2 points. Just sort of scale to give it a bit more rounded look. Let's also select these loops and scale them on the x-axis just a tiny bit. And then we're going to select these two and move them slightly on the y-axis like that. Also select these ones. So we're sort of just fine-tuning the shape so that it looks a bit more rounded. Maybe let's select these sort of loop, this loop down here, and we're going to also move this on the x-axis to give it a bit more rounded look. Let's move the entire controller above the floor so that it's easier to work with it. Let's go ahead and select maybe select this edge and then select this one by control clicking here and then sort of move it tiny bit down. Let's move this edge a little bit up above like that. Let's select these 2 points and move it out on the y-axis just a tiny bit to give it more rounded look. And then I think we might need to select these points in the middle and move it slightly on the y-axis. Whoops, okay, I messed it up by moving it a little too much. And then select these points and move it up on the z-axis a tiny bit, and then move it on the y-axis to give it more rounded look. Okay, and let's enable proportional editing and select these points here, and then we can move it on the y-axis. And as we're doing this, let's go to the top view. It's going to be a bit easier there. And let's go ahead and grab it, and we're going to change the fall off, and let's limit it to the y-axis. Let's select the entire model and turn on proportional editing, scale it on the y-axis to make it a bit smaller again. Okay, there's a bit of bulk here. We might need to sort of separate this edge a little bit on the x-axis. Okay, I think it looks good for now. If we need, we can add more details later. Let's create some controlling points at the top. So shift right click and add a circle. And with 10 sides for the circle, we're going to scale it down, fill it up, and let's extrude it up. We're going to move it in like that. And let's add an inset, extrude it out, scale it up again, add another extrusion, and then add an inset, extrude it inwards, add an inset. Let's add a subdiv modifier, and then we're going to add some supporting loops down there, one up here, and then maybe one loop here, and then we can just sort of bevel it with no segments. And let's alt click on this to select the entire loop, Control plus to add to our selection. So if we press Control minus and plus, you can see, so we're just sort of selecting that loop, and then we can scale it down inwards a little bit and move it up on the z-axis to reduce that a little bit. And then we're going to add one more loop cut here and make it more thinner. And then also, let's just sort of move it down slightly like that. Let's move it on the y-axis a tiny bit on the z-axis like that. Shift D to duplicate along the x-axis and put it here. For the buttons, we're going to shift right click here and add a circle, make it small, like that, fill it, extrude, and then we're going to go ahead and bevel it with one loop, I think, in between, and add a subdiv modifier. Let's add a supporting loop down there, move it inwards, go back to the top view, and Shift D to duplicate, put it here, and then Shift D to duplicate again. And then we're going to shift right click here, add a plane object, and scale it down like that. And now we're going to go ahead and add 2 loop cuts this way and 2 loop cuts this way. Now we can go ahead and select these faces and delete them. Select everything and then extrude it up. Add a subdiv modifier, and then we just need to add some controlling loops. So let's add one there, one close here, so we're basically adding a few controlling loop cuts so that we can keep this sort of plus shape. Let's shade smooth everything. We might need to select this entire edge loop and bevel it with no segments. And then finally, if you want, you can sort of select this inner part, and then let's go to the top view and enable X-ray mode. Using the vertex selection mode, we can go ahead and select sort of this entire inner part and enable proportional editing. And now we can go ahead and grab it on the z-axis to give it a bit of sort of center. Let's select everything and move it up. And now with that selection, we can sort of give it a bit of shape like this. And let's move it down. And we're going to grab it slightly to this side. And you know what, let's just also create a button in this area. So we're going to go ahead and add a inset like this and turn off the proportional editing. Let's scale it up on the x-axis a little bit, local x, and we're going to scale it up a little bit again, and then we can extrude it out like that, and then add a loop cut here for supporting. Now we can go ahead and add a loop cut here to give it a bit more shape like that, but I think I'm okay with the shape. If you want, you can add sort of more detail to it and sort of play around with the shape, but I'm okay with the shape. I like it, so I'm going to select everything and select the controller body and then parent everything together. And it's a little too small, so to make it more rounded and cute, I'm going to scale up. Okay, so there we have it. So there's the controller, and maybe we can now go ahead and select this keyboard and this controller. You know what, let's select this controller and then shift bracket to select all of its children. So that's going to make sure everything is selected. And then we can select the keyboard and both parts of the keyboard, Shift D to duplicate. And then we're going to go ahead and move them on the x-axis like that. Grab them on the z-axis. And just sort of place it closer to this sort of rack area. And then same thing for this keyboard. And now we can rotate this 90 degrees negative. And let's also rotate this, I think, 50 degrees. And let's just make sure that it's placed properly up there. And then again, I'm going to move it slightly on the y-axis like that. And then again, I'm going to select controller and shift right bracket to select the controller children. And then we can create one more copy of this keyboard, Shift D, move it on the z-axis and x-axis like that. If you want, you can add more props to this sort of rack area and maybe move some of the plants up there, but I think I'm happy with how it is right now. And also, we're going to select this tablet and add a bit of rotation to it so that it looks better. Place it here, and also I'm going to scale up this console a little bit. Just sort of fine-tuning this, and I think I'm going to also sort of scale up this stand a little bit on the y-axis. And same thing here, so I'm going to select, scale this, and then if I press Y twice, it's going to make sure that it's on the local y-axis. There we go. I think we've completed the modeling phase. Now, if you want to add some wires for the keyboard and mouse, that's pretty simple. You just add a Bezier curve, just like we did with these plants, and then you just move those controlling points. One more thing that you can do is that if you go to the top view, let's shift right click here, and then you can add a Bezier path or curve, it doesn't really matter, and then tap into edit mode and delete all of the vertices. Now on the toolbar, you can select this drawing tool, and then you can simply draw the wire. So now it's going to make it really easy. And now if you look down there, so we have that just point that we just made, and then under the properties, you can go ahead and add a bit of thickness. So just like that, you'll have wires. You can also sort of now from this point on, start editing it again. So you can select these points and sort of start moving them down, and maybe adding more extrusions by pressing E and moving it more towards the bottom side. And you can do same thing for the mouse if you want to, or you can just simply duplicate this and move it on the y-axis. And then select some of these points and move them on the ground. Finally this point here, and let's go ahead and move it on the ground. Add a bit of rotation to it. Select this point here, add a bit of rotation. And just like that, you can see we have some cables and wires on the desk. I think it's going to make it look a little bit better. So there we have it. Now let's go ahead and save our file, and then we can move on to organizing and sort of setting up everything properly.